Hey, Rob.
Bud, how you been?
Hi, man. Good to hear your voice. How are things going?
Very good, very good. Congratulations on all the great reviews you've gotten on the book. You must feel really good about that.
Yeah. I feel good. Yeah. I guess writers being miserable specimens of humanity. One can always imagine a more terrific review, more influential. Barack Obama spotted with one of my books in his hand, getting on an airplane, that kind of thing.
We're going to work on that today, don't worry.
Good.
Your manuscript has traveled to so many places with me, sort of in imitation of Lolita herself. I've grown quite fond of it,
Good. I was just thinking the other day that I'm for me when a book comes out, it's always kind of an anxious time as well as you feel happy, gratified, whatever. But right. I feel pretty good about these two, and have been just screwing off, really. I should be working on something new, but.
Well, it must be, I think you worked on this book for about 3 years, right? In terms of the actual...
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, it must be a great relief to just let it go and take a little break, I would imagine.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. And also it was kind of Nabokov is such a complicated figure, and my own responses to him are so mixed. There's some stuff I love, some stuff I really could do without. I hate his snottiness. I love his this or that. That it was kind of at the end. It was kind of exhausting intellectually. Because I'd written a big manuscript and I was following various different threads, and
It's truly admirable how many threads you have in the book that did not go unnoticed, and I want to try to follow some of them today. I thought we could begin with your portrait of Nabokov before he arrived in America. Quote, the Nabokovs had been through the historical ringer. They were Zelig-like figures of 20th century catastrophe, little people with a monstrous evil breathing down their necks. What was life like for them before they arrived in the States?
I think the most important thing was how threadbare it was. They were really without much scratch, and they, for years. And he was, they got pretty adept at it. Like he was not prone to depression or worry, particularly. I would say much less so than a lot of struggling artists. She was kind of a worrier. She was the worrywart, and so it was a life lived without very much. At the same time, he was writing a lot. He's prolific, and she believed in him 150%. So there was all kinds of joy surrounding his his writing achievements in Russian, and then when he started crossing over into English. So I would say and they were always living in kind of scruffy digs, kind of appropriate for a wannabe famous writer.
And of course, he had to worry more because, as we can see all throughout his biography, she took care of the basic reality function that he tended to ignore, like any good intuitive writer, I would imagine.
Yeah, and where the hell is that wife for me or for you? Or really,
right,
she was.
Well, I think that wife doesn't exist anymore in 2015. It's
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You say there is beauty and magic all over Nabokov's body of work, but the claim to greatness rests most solidly on the American efforts. And you note that Lolita did not spring from a Mozartian well of inner genius. How did his American experience transform him as a man and as a writer?
I think, gosh, it's a very large question. I'd say something that other biographers haven't talked about very much was, and that for me seemed really important, was that actually getting to America was a tremendous led to a tremendous burst of relief and hope, just on the basic level.
I mean, he even caught the last ship out of France before the Nazis ran wild.
That's right. Yeah, and that same ship, after the Champlain, after dropping them off in New York, returned to France and was sunk by a mine off the French coast. So,
Skin of his teeth.
Yeah, really skin of his teeth. So getting here was like, I found his very first responses to seeing New York Harbor in some letters, and and you can see he's happy. I mean, he's just like anybody who gets out of an impossible situation and can finally admit to himself how desperate it was. He was just really kind of overjoyed. And then this lifelong obsession with collecting butterflies meant that he was just rubbing his hands, hoping for the first opportunity to get out there into that big-ass country that he'd been reading about for, at least 30 years, since he was a little boy, reading about all these great places to hunt butterflies. So, he was very unlike other emigres, who I think I say in the book tended to huddle in these little enclaves, mostly in New York. And, a lot of those people lived their whole lives continuing to speak German or Russian or Hungarian to each other. But he very quickly got out into the whole country. And so, that can in itself be, if you're of the right temperament, a great accelerant to your hopefulness. And if you find a way to write about it, it's like, wow, that's really, really great. I mean, other very, very talented writers who came over more or less at the same time, Brecht and Thomas Mann, they couldn't do it. They couldn't get a handle on America. And, they disdained America. And so they had many reasons not to write about it. And Nabokov disdained it in some ways, but he also enjoyed the hell out of it, and he did find ways to write about it.
And it's very interesting what you just said, because that burst of euphoria, you really can see it in between the lines of Lolita, particularly in the descriptions of landscape and in the almost carnival-like atmosphere of the goofy things that he found, the roadside attractions and so on in America. You say he traveled about 200,000 miles by car as he zigzagged across the country. And in one of your letters to me a couple of years ago, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to quote a couple of letters, but we can delete them later if you don't want that. You wrote, there was an interesting concatenation of road trips published around the same moment. Kerouac's Lolita, America Day by Simone de Beauvoir, Air Conditioned Nightmare by Henry Miller, Clancy Sigel's memoir Going Away, and Steinbeck's Travel with Charlie. In your book, you say other authors of the post-war moment mocked a sanitized America, prominent among them Miller and Kerouac. Kerouac's work of the 40s and 50s would seem definingly un-Nabokovian, but the Dharma Bums stubbornly lays hold of Nabokovian materials and approaches. How do these books resonate beside Lolita, and what are the specific correspondences with the Dharma Bums?
That's another good question. I think I'm not as big a fan of On the Road as you are and as many millions of other people are, but the Dharma Bums to me is a great novel.
I actually agree with you on that point. I think the Dharma Bums and is one of his last books, Vanity of Diloise, are by far the greatest books, far beyond On the Road. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I found, reading them, obviously they're very, very different. The hero of the Dharma Bums is he's kind of on a journey of purification and self-simplification. He's kind of becoming a bit of a saint himself. A saint of who lives in this world, but and obviously Humbert is a more fictionalized character and a much darker, more evil person, but is also transformed by his travels. I mean, there's just in his attitude towards his little sex captive, his glee at having access to her body at the beginning turns into this kind of inexhaustible fascination with her. And he loves her, and he falls in love with her. And at the same time, there's a birth of, you don't want to say that the guy feels guilty, but he does have a consciousness of the enormity of what he's doing to her. And so there's a tremendous spiritual evolution, even in this very evil person. So, the books are like each other that way. And then there's this great joy in the landscape. I mean, in the Dharma Bums, it's all over it. And also, the hero keeps bursting out into little bits of poetry. And, Lolita is full of quotations of poetry and lines of kind of prose poetry. So, while those two books are written in very different registers, to me they're terrifically relaxing to read. I mean, there's the voices are completely assured and morally questing, brilliantly observatory, and with like full, I don't want to use fancy words, but like full sensoria attuned to the reality that the characters are living through. Like, just the way we see the colors and the shapes and the characteristics of the country registered. There's something very, very similar to me as a reader in both of those books.
And with the other books that you mentioned, I mean, I found it fascinating that you approach Lolita as a road book, in the tradition of these other books that you mentioned.
Yeah, right.
Well.
I mean, that's an older, tradition. I mean, it starts with, Captain John Smith, and then Bartram, and then Crevecoeur, and these other, Chateaubriand, if I pronounced that right. They came over and they traveled all through America, registering this vast continent, as much of it as they could see. So, Nabokov's in that tradition too, but I think in the post-war moment, there was still a lot of, there was like a renewed energy to get out into America and report on what it was like.
Absolutely.
I don't know why exactly. Maybe it had something to do with the war. And kind of America had come out of the war whole, not destroyed, and in some ways heroic, and people wanted to take its measure.
It's fascinating. We can see how far ahead of its time Lolita was in capturing the idiom and attitude of America at mid-century. If we compare it to certain other works of roughly the same period, except for a couple of the erotic scenes, Edmund Wilson's Memoirs of Hecate County, published in 1946, as you point out, a very important book in the history of censorship, which came out only 10 years before Lolita, more resembles the work of Henry James in terms of overall style, diction, and sensibility, whereas with Nabokov, as you say, quote, a darkly dissident cultural skepticism comes into play with Lolita. The extent of it will become clear over the next decade and a half, and tonal similarities abound in the movies, in productions like Hitchcock's Psycho from 1961, and Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, 1964, and in literature and other cultural domains with the roiling intensity now associated with the term the 60s. Alert readers, pick something up. I thought that was a marvelous quote, by the way.
Thank you. Is that a question?
No, it's just something for you to bounce off of, if you can.
Yeah. For me, all of the changes of the 60s were almost not possible without Lolita. And when I first read that, I think I first read Lolita, I don't know, I was still a teenager, late teenager. I was just electrified. I mean, the whole moral dimension of the book went completely over my head. I knew that something bad was happening to a little girl, but, I was, I wasn't ready to, because the rest of the book was just so shockingly true of what I had, dimly started to feel, and an awful lot of people had dimly started to feel, and suddenly these observations were being put into words, and so I really kind of, for me anyway, that awakening started with the way he looked at the country and the way he talked without apology, and made dark, hysterical fun of it, while he was doing many other things too with his prose. So it was, I don't know. I also, I think, I wouldn't quite agree with you that Memoirs of Hecate County belongs to Henry James. Not that Henry James is some lesser example, but...
I didn't mean, by the way, I should have made this clearer, I didn't mean in terms of content necessarily, because he is talking about the 1920s. But I meant if you look at the grammar and the basic sentence structure and the sort of tone, and it's a sort of very, even though Edmund Wilson wasn't an aristocrat, it almost has an aristocratic type of tone. He mentions his black servant, and it sort of resonated for me as being closer to 19th century type of prose than something like Lolita or the books that you mentioned that come after Lolita.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And he has this Wilson has this kind of grand cathedral organ of a writing style. He has, and it's pretty simplified in Memoirs of Hecate County, but still there are echoes of, Jamesian paragraphs that are perfectly shaped, Of course, Lolita's got a tremendous literary culture in it and behind it. But
and the slang, which apparently, as you point out, Nabokov really studied the slang of teenagers talking at that time. You find none of that in Hecate County, which is only 10 years before. It's really more the way people spoke in the 1920s. So I don't mean to pick on that book. I think it's a marvelous, wonderful, wonderful book. But it just struck me that we could take that book or other books from around this period and compare it to, as E.M. Forrester does in his classic aspects of the novel. He's got a half a dozen novelists sitting around from different periods. And sometimes two authors separated by 150 years sound more alike than two from 10 years apart.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's interesting what you point out, and the idea that an immigrant could make that leap, that tonal leap. It's I don't really think I can explain it. It's you have to fall back on, or I have to fall back on, just that Nabokov was good and very audacious, and I think that's the other really big thing that he got from being in America. He got the sense of this vast country. He read really very, very widely in the contemporary literature of the time, and he knew things were the ice jam was breaking up around censorship. He was very afraid of it. He didn't want to end up in jail or losing whatever money he had, but he could sense there was a change coming, and somehow being in America and being kind of joyous about it and seeing what his contemporaries were daring to do made him much, much bolder than he'd ever been. When he was writing Russian novels, he would also burn the ears of some of his readers, in the 1920s and 1930s, but it was nothing like the leap that he felt he could take when he started writing Lolita in the late 40s.
Yeah, he certainly had the boldness of a great artist.
Yeah, yeah, I guess that. I mean, what defines a great artist? At least in his case, there was a boldness. Yeah, it was certainly, and he just felt he could go the whole hog in America. He also, I mean, it was not lost on him that the hottest and most promising novelists of his time were writing sex books, of one form or another, and also the tremendously successful commercial writers like Grace Metalius wrote Peyton Place. So he picked up on that, and that was the direction he wanted to go in too. I mean, he'd always written sexy books, not pornographic books, but that was something that he that felt very comfortable.
Yes. In rereading Lolita, I was struck by what a mysterious and enchanting story it is, and with each reading, the pedantic allusions seem less important, while the emotion of the tale comes more to the fore. As you note, it's a parody of the romantic confessional novel, but there are all these hermetic references, but it's also much more than that. You quote Nabokov's former student, Alfred Appel, who says Nabokov found ways to make parody play for pathos as well as for laughs. The novel has it both ways, involving the reader in a deeply moving yet outrageously comic story. Would you agree that the emotional dimension increasingly resonates despite the author's cynicism about all forms of sentiment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why millions of people have read the book, and it still, continues to sell in vast numbers. I mean, it's
interesting.
on one level, it's it's a very simple, heartbreaking story that ends in terrible tragedy, and he didn't leave that out. I mean, in other of his books, you see him kind of working at cross purposes to his own moral impulses. He can't stop mocking them and undercutting them. Simple sentiment is held up to ridicule. That sort of ruins a lot of his books for me. Because that happens, and because he falls in love with his own
florid prose.
Perceptions. Well, his prose, but also he'll have what seems to him a brilliant idea for a novel, and then he executes it, and that's really what he's about. Showing that he can do that. Very impressive sometimes, but here, this is a story of a completely believable little girl, and this completely believable pedophile is also strangely attractive and fascinating to follow.
Yes.
And I mean, it's just
it makes the book really a lot different than a lot of his other books, I think. I agree with you.
Right.
It's pretty clear from the biographical data that Nabokov never embarked upon the sort of sexual transgression that Lolita's protagonist was known for. So what I'm more interested in exploring with you is why his creative process was so focused on this theme and what it reflected for him personally and psychologically. You say, quote, he would return to the theme of the bodies of young girls in other texts, so that from one perspective, his entire body of work can be said to be centrally about this matter.
Right. Well, I think it's maybe useful to keep in mind that this period when he's writing, let's say 30s through 60s, it was a period of great sexual awakening, of bringing sexual material into the scope, the unashamed scope of serious writing. So, so he was with that. He was with that enterprise, and I think that at the time when he started to write about a pedophile, he and some other writers convinced themselves that they were being daring to write about that. It's sort of like, if sex had been said to consist of kissing and fondling and writing love letters, and suddenly somebody said, no, it's that, and it's also tucking. He felt that he was bringing a new species of forbidden sexuality into play, and that was part of the bold enterprise of being. So, nowadays a lot of people who hate the novel and still want to ban it, say that that kind of thing should never be written about. But back when he was starting to write about it in the late 40s, there was nothing like that agreement that this is somehow beyond the pale. So I think he was okay. So he was in a way doing what he thought was noble work to write about that.
Yeah.
But it's also tremendously promising to him. And I think it was promising. I don't know. I think like a friend of mine is currently reading Lolita, and he said that he's really digging it. And he said, but it's making him look at little girls differently. He's making him relax his normal way of, that's a pretty little girl, but we just don't look at her that way because that's wrong. Well, reading Nabokov on it, he's looking at little girls differently, and for whatever reason, I guess Nabokov, found them to be fascinating. I think personally, as a man, that doesn't mean that he ever interfered with them. I don't think he ever did, and I like what one of his. He had various flirtations when he was a college teacher, and one beautiful co-ed who we got very close to at Wellesley was interviewed years later, and she said he definitely liked girls. He just didn't like little ones.
Right.
So I don't think he had ever had a personal involvement in that. Okay,
right.
But he did look at them and see them in their. He was sensitive to how they were sexy and and a turn on and fascinating and beautiful.
Now, I don't mean to imply, as you and I have spoken about before, art is a mystery, great writing is a mystery. I don't mean to imply that there's a direct causal connection or just one explanation for any of this, but there were a couple of other angles I wanted to bring up with you on this theme. One is, in Speak Memory, Nabokov reports that when he was 10 years old, he met a girl named Colette on the beach at Biarritz. For the next 2 months, he thought of her constantly. In a phrase reminiscent of Lolita, he says one night he, quote, lay awake planning our flight. Thought that was an interesting, turn of phrase. Humbert traces his later impulse for pedophilia back to a similar childhood encounter with a girl on a beach. And there are two girls in Nabokov's memoir who elicit his early passion, just as there are two key nymphets who precede Humbert's encounter with Lolita. How do you interpret all that, and are we to take him at his word here?
Well, I think definitely certain very good writers use their autobiographical material. Most of us writers feel there's nothing else left to us. If we can't use our autobiographical material somehow, transmogrified quite often, then what do we have? So, he was, I think he was definitely close to his own memories and his own, he could recall the intensity of that, just pre-pubertal fascination with a little girl, with a girl his age. He could recall. I had, romances when I was 11 that were really intense too. I can't recall them the way he can recall his, but I think he's quite obviously drawing on his own.
Drawing on something, absolutely. Material. And one last thought on this line of. Is in his dream journal, he writes, quote, I am thinking rather smugly that nobody had ever rendered the name of nostalgia better than I. As you know, nostalgia, and you're touching on this now, is often constellated as a result of something not being lived to its fullest, often something of great emotional import. A scene from our past returns to haunt us because it contains an emotional complex in need of further development. I'm reminded of one of the final images in Citizen Kane with the close-up of the sleigh named Rosebud, perhaps a symbol of lost childhood innocence. Is it possible that the nymphette in Nabokovian literature symbolized a rosebud complex for Nabokov? That is, a sensibility untainted by his hyper-intellectualism and his abundant cerebral cynicism, a counterpoint to his consciousness.
Yeah, I think that says it very carefully. And I find throughout his writing, especially the stuff that I like, he's quick to make himself an object of humor. Nabokov is, or the heroes that are very clearly, stand-ins for him. And I think it's because, just as you described, this is a very intellectual, deeply learned guy, powerful mind, but he's always kind of reminding himself that he's that mug he sees in the mirror. He's a little fat, and he's bald now, and he's got false teeth, and, something funny happened at the cocktail party last night where he spilled everything on his lap. And, he's not ashamed to bring himself in as an object of fun and, to humanize himself. And I think that's part of the appeal of Humbert Humbert too. Humbert's he's a monster, but he's also making delicious fun of himself.
Oh, he's completely self-effacing.
And he's also, quite aware of how ridiculous he must seem, a guy with a funny foreign accent in suburban America, but he plays his role, this is who I am. I think somehow Nabokov, through a lot of work and great gifts, but mainly through a lot of work, found ways of combining his intellecting power, his pure conceptual power and his deep learning and all these different languages with that simple, in-touchness with, his ordinary human feelings of embarrassment and excitement and, self-mockery. So I put those things together.
Tell me who this sounds like to you. Quote, "Finally, what I decided I'd do, I decided I'd go away. I'd start hitchhiking my way out west. What I'd do, I figured, I'd go down to the Holland Tunnel and bum a ride, and then I'd bum another one and another one and another one. And in a few days, I'd be somewhere out west where it was very pretty and sunny and where nobody'd know me, and I'd get a job. I figured I could get a job at a filling station somewhere, putting gas and oil in people's cars."
That sounds to me like an awful lot of writers. I mean, it sounds like James Salter. It sounds like Kerouac. This could be a line from a Norman Mailer novel.
Yeah, you mentioned Kerouac. It's funny because you tapped very deeply into The Catcher in the Rye for this book, and I was also rereading it for my own work at the same time. And I thought in terms of tone and diction and style, it was very reminiscent of Kerouac and On the Road. But it's from the final pages of Catcher in the Rye, just before Holden Caulfield cracks up. And, I thought from this one could conclude that Catcher strangely anticipates Kerouac's road books. I just wanted to bring that up with you. I thought it was fascinating, And maybe you could also talk about the interesting parallels that you found between Lolita and The Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah, well, I would say more generally, like, there's a parallel between Salinger and Nabokov. There's, as I talk about it in the book, how they merged as writers at exact same moment, and they were inevitably very aware of each other. We know because Nabokov actually went out of his way and said some praising things about this guy, Salinger. He almost never said anything nice about a contemporary writer.
Right.
But then there's the beautiful little girl, the beautiful, vulnerable little girl, is this radiant source of meaning in both of their most famous works. Phoebe is Holden's little sister, Catcher in the Rye, and Catcher in the Rye is a teenage boy, so he doesn't have anything like Humbert's awareness of his own sexuality, but there's this fascination that's for some reason post-war, little girls and their beauty and their fun and their goodness were, I think, very meaningful symbols. Maybe after the war and all the death and the impossible horrors, to look at a child and see her as this radiant kind of human reminder of perfection was, that both these writers picked up on that.
Throughout the history of symbolism, the child has always been a a symbol of rebirth, hasn't it? Especially the female child, it's the rebirth of the soul.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. In American literature, think of Pearl and the Scarlet Letter, and Daisy Miller, and slightly older girl, but definitely. And so both of them are obsessed with beautiful little girls, and I don't know. The focus of my book was not to try to explain whether it can ever be explained why certain tropes appear at a given historical moment, but.
Well, I just thought it was fascinating the way you compared the fact that you brought up the fact that they're both writing contemporaneously, and yet the treatment is so completely different. I mean, as you say, quote, both find a fertile subject in post-war teenagerhood. Both invoke an America in which to write about magical young girls is somehow a necessary thing, a key to what is. And yet, as you discussed, there are also vast differences. Quote, Humbert soon does to Dolly something that Holden, in his fragile emotional state, might have found unbearable to hear or even think about.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then Holden is sexually naive, at times almost pre-sexual in attitude, whereas Humbert is devoured by his narcissistic fetishism. Holden wants to preserve untainted childhood. He even tries to efface the obscene graffiti scrawled on the wall. Whereas Humbert only cares about his own solipsistic world of self-gratification.
Right. They're sort of like different poles, around this, which that to me is kind of suggestive. I like that pairing for that reason. When I reread Catcher in the Rye, I felt Holden is so straightforward and talks to us on such an intimate level that we assume he's very sophisticated. But I kept feeling this sexual terror in him. He's going to have a hard time growing up, actually.
Oh, that's such a good point. It's something only a really good writer can do, especially with the first-person narrative, to let the reader know, and indeed, in fact, there's so much else going on that's not being said here, right?
Right.
The fear. I mean, he sort of dramatizes it, I think, in that scene where he's in New York City and he tries to get a prostitute to come to his room, but then he doesn't want to do anything with her, and so on.
Right.
Do you remember that? Yeah.
Yeah. Right. It's very. I've always been puzzled and saddened by how little came of Salinger as a writer after his great period. And there was, I don't know. Well, as we do know, he was kind of caught up in romances with younger women. He didn't have a fully mature wife and saintly amanuensis that Nabokov did, and but there was, somehow I felt, under other circumstances he would have gone much farther, written a whole lot of other stuff.
No, I agree with you. In Moby-Dick, the old Manxman, in comparing Pip and Ahab, says, "One daft with strength, the other daft with weakness." By befriending Pip, whom you call an enchanting child, Ahab is indirectly acknowledging the value of vulnerability. Charles Olson says that, quote, "From this moment, Ahab's tone is richer, quieter, less angry and strident. He even questions his former blasphemies, for a bottomed sadness grows in him." What Pip wrought in Ahab throws over the end of Moby-Dick a veil of grief. This is also reminiscent of Humbert's character shift at the end of Lolita. Perhaps you could talk about your comparison between these two books.
Yeah, well, I know Nabokov read Moby-Dick and had a period of discussing it intensely with a lab assistant he had at Harvard when he was working in the museum organizing the butterflies, and he was really very taken up with the book for a while. So, and Melville is an unusual figure in the American pantheon, and Nabokov never said anything snotty about him. He praised him, and there are signs of his admiration in Lolita. So, yeah, for me, Lolita is a very sad, dark story that we can't believe and don't want to believe that we see the trajectory, but we do sense it well before the end. And so, but Humbert's growing love for Lolita, for the little girl who's now growing up, and finally for the young woman who's pregnant by another man who he sees at the end of the book, it doesn't take away what he's done and the horror of it and so forth, but it makes it much more bearable and much more moving. And I think the same thing, Captain Ahab. I mean, that's even more of a preordained catastrophe. We sense that very, very early. So I don't think that Melville developed that humanizing of Ahab the way Nabokov developed Humbert's change. I mean, it was not what Melville was principally after, but he had these great instincts, Melville. And so he knew he had to do something. He had to put in some other colors. And I find that all that business was very, very moving. Those are parts of Moby-Dick that I most remember. Nobody else does, but for me they were really important.
Would you agree that Nabokov's sympathetic portrayal of this ghastly figure, Humbert, is the real genius of the book? Or one of the key.
Sure. It's a great accomplishment. Again, it's something he's been working at through a lot of other books. I mean, he has many other kind of monstrous, cracked heroes or protagonists or anti-heroes. So he's been working at that for a long time. I would say that, the genius of the book, and I'm always nervous about using that word genius, but
I see, right.
But the greatness of the book, I feel fine with that. But is in its encounter with America too. What it said about just the fact that he found America enticing and very beautiful, and he was able to respond to the great open door that America shows to people. Come on, look at all of me. Come down and explore, and that he could respond to that, but also sense mystery and doom in the landscape. I mean, that was an act of extraordinary receptivity or creativity. I don't know exactly what. It's so.
And also the goofiness of the landscape as well.
Yeah, right. Completely. All the wonderful vulgar touches. I wouldn't say it's just Humbert. I mean, Humbert's voice is, inseparable from what's great about the novel. It's superb, but it's not just that.
Right.
And I would say, the moral evolution is also kind of unexpected and unexpectedly moving.
In another one of your letters written to me while you were working on Nabokov in America, you say, quote, "Still haven't figured out how to interrogate Nabokov over his finicky, self-adoring, I am a genius body of work, nor over his savage attacks on all signs of honest creativity in other writers of his time. Henry Miller certainly among the targets of his loathing, and also Faulkner and Mann and Malraux and Pasternak and Hemingway and all the women authors, and just about everybody except that equally finicky young New Yorker writer Updike, who kissed the master's ass and therefore won words of praise. The reading about him has led me down some interesting byroads. He is a large writer, I discover, all of the issues of modernism present in him, not to mention all of 20th century political history and some issues of science relating to his butterflies. But while large, many of his books seem small to me. That's not necessarily bad, but maybe it explains some of his viciousness toward other writers who, in their non-Mandarin prose, touched regions of the soul he intuited but couldn't visit. And in your book, you add, Knut Hamsun joins Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Leskov, and dozens of other writers of authentic power on Nabokov's list of little or no respect. Did Nabokov suffer from an unconscious doubt about his own value, or was he just blind to the emotional power of these writers because of his own emotional shortcomings?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think, yes, there was some great doubt in him. And, otherwise, why do you keep insisting that the world acknowledge you as a genius?
Mm-hmm.
Even at your last decade, your last years of life, he's still insisting that people recognize that he's a genius at creating chess problems of the Solus Rex type, that is, a genius of Russian poetry, that, the list goes on, and the accomplishments were fully acknowledged by the world by the time he was 65, and yet he still needed it, and so I don't know. That bespeaks some kind of some I don't know. To be a great writer, a greatly gifted writer at the time of modernism is a very big problem, because basically the modernist task was to write hateful and disturbing and disruptive novels that would give avid, normal novel readers a terrible headache. So we see, it's all in, it doesn't begin with Ulysses, but Ulysses is a great example of, you really need to read it in a college class with an inspiring professor who can tell you, don't be bored by this chapter. It's really wonderful. And, I think somebody once said of it that, it's a demonstration of how not to write a novel. So anyway, Nabokov is fully sensitive to his times, and he's not going to write straightforward, middlebrow novels. Not him, by God. And so he accepts the modernist task, but at the same time, he's the guy who loves to be in intimate contact with his readers. He loves to move them. He loves to fascinate and enchant them. And so somehow by an almost impossible contortion, he arrives eventually, when he's in America, at an opportunity to write in a way that almost anybody can read, that isn't giving up of his modernist task. So that was a tremendous struggle. And I see a lot of his unhappiness and the vicious things he said about other writers as a reflection of just how impossible it felt to him through most of his career. It's amazing he was as productive, continually productive, as he was. You only have to compare a really boring, failed novel like Ben Sinister, which came out, I think, in 1946, to Lolita, which he started writing in 1947, and which is so phenomenally readable and wonderful and moving and deeply complex but open-hearted. Whereas the other one is none of those things. You see how what a tremendous load he was carrying, and he had to find a way to put it off his back and yet not disrespect it and move on. And, I think, at least to me, a lot of his strange behavior reflects that.
Fascinating. You also document the tragic loss of friendship between Nabokov and Edmund Wilson. You call it, quote, a savage, ultra-public bloodletting. Although intellectual disagreements were the supposed cause of the rupture, there's also the fact that Wilson went out of his way to help and support so many other writers, while Nabokov went out of his way to disparage them. How did Wilson feel about Nabokov's loathing of past and present literary figures, some of whom Wilson was promulgating in his critical essays?
Yeah, I think that was really the straw that broke the camel's back for Wilson, because he never was comfortable with that, and they had arguments about that, and finally, when various other kind of wounds to the ego on both sides had mounted up to a certain level, which happens with a deep friendship where people are perhaps obsessively frank with each other, finally, he just, when Nabokov went off like a madman against Pasternak, for Wilson, that was just, you could see him saying to himself, I just cannot fucking understand this guy.
He even called him sadistic at one point,
Yeah, that's right. And those, there's a level of saying nastiness about other writers that goes along with the literary life. I mean, it's not unknown, of course, but this was way over the top, and I think Wilson could he couldn't explain it away himself, and so that was very, very important to their breaking up. I mean, to me it seemed very, very sad, because they had almost just a truly wonderful friendship, and deeply enjoyed each other's company. Their letters are, for me, maybe the most fun literary correspondence of the 20th century. I mean, I haven't read all the famous correspondences, but I've read a lot of them, and it's just they're tremendously witty, and you can see how inspired they are by each other's letters. So, and then when they got together, they would swap dirty books. Wilson gives Nabokov a copy of The Story of O, and they get together quickly so they can talk about it. And Vera's nose is out of joint because she knows they're talking about some dirty subject that's snickering. They're just having a good time. And to see that all sacrificed, that's kind of sad.
Kind of sad, yeah. You call Pale Fire esoteric and spiritualistic. Quote, it makes a case for a higher realm. The existence of a dimension is implied by anomalies of this world we inhabit. The great mind that decrees a world of doubles, riddling coincidences, and secret correspondences is, by a curious coincidence, the very model of the mind that can understand it. This spiritual project is an old one in American letters. Emerson, Hawthorne, Whitman, and Dickinson, along with many lesser-known authors, make up one cohort of spirit seekers. But by the end of the 19th century, metaphysical speculation had fallen somewhat out of favor. I'm intrigued by how, unlike these other spirit seekers, Nabokov approaches this realm more through an archly cerebral mind game rather than through a feeling-toned intuition. I mean, with most of his work. With him, it's more of an intellectualized intuition, such as you'd find in a Sherlock Holmes story. Would you agree?
Well, I would say that I think he started with the same intimations that maybe a lot of us have about, materialism doesn't explain the whole kit and caboodle, that there are unexplained coincidences that are so suggestive and things happen in every life if you're paying attention that are just eerie. I think he had all of those usual sensations and experiences, and in Sweet Memory he talks about them, and elsewhere too. And then, being himself, of course, he had to try to get rigorous about it, or try to. I mean, he was always very careful because he didn't want people to mock him, and he didn't want to be seen as a new Arthur Conan Doyle, who spent many years around Ouija boards, and but he had just, I think, the ordinary sensations of sensitivity to spirits. I don't know how else to talk about it.
Right. The whole non-rational world.
Yeah, right. And at the same time, he's this very hyper-intellectual writer and also a pretty serious scientist, lepidopterist. And, I mean, in that area, too, you see him just barely restraining himself because he's like, he doesn't really believe in Darwinism. He's just like a creationist a lot of times. This world is too fabulous, too full of strange suggestions and eerie, magnificent complexities to have evolved through something as corny and stolid as evolution. He doesn't really believe it, and a number of modern Nabokov scholars are quickly trying to brush all that under the rug and saying that, well, we misunderstood how brilliant are his insights into evolution. It's not that he rejects it; it's that he's talking about it on a whole higher realm than we are. But no, I think he really, he was like an intelligent design believer.
You just mentioned Nabokov scholars. In your book, you write, the scholars of Nabokov rejoice in discovering what is complexly hidden. Nuggets of hidden reference are everywhere, but there is an esoteric and ever-narrowing quality to the hunt. When will the picking over be complete? Can we not get back to saying more obvious, possibly more urgent things about the curious author? How did you attempt to borrow Nabokov back from the experts?
Well, I'm sure the experts don't think that I've done it adequately, but I did read all of what they wrote. I think I mentioned in the book, I sat around for a couple of years reading almost nothing but Nabokov criticism, and so I had to see what they had been saying, and it was really a lot of fun. Basically, I mean, some of the stuff is head-bangingly boring, but a lot of it's really good, and so I at least had to be familiar with their lines of analysis. But I think it's part of the scholarly enterprise is to be in some ways very modest, to look for unfound little factoids or allusions in texts, and to bring them forth and to talk about them in a rigorous way and make as much as you can out of them. And this book, anyway, I mean, I tried to be very specific about the few texts that I talk about, his American texts, but I'm talking about the guy's whole life, so I couldn't, and I didn't want to talk about, an allusion to Dos Passos that's hidden on page 129 of Lolita that nobody's seen before. I mean, that's not the kind of writing I want to do.
Right. And as I mentioned before, when I've reread this twice in the last couple of years, preparing for this talk today, and I happen to have the annotated Lolita. You're familiar with that, right? And it's got It's got all the illusions that you could possibly want, and it was apparently crafted with Nabokov's approval.
Right.
That's why, in the rereading of it, all of those things just seem so much less important to me than the pure, raw feeling and emotion of the characters.
Yeah, me too. And yet, also, there are moments when it's a great fun to curl up with Apple's annotated Lolita, and he's a smart guy who did a lot of hard work.
Sure.
And he brings in things that I never would have thought of. And by the same token, Brian Boyd, who wrote the big double-volume biography of Nabokov, has just completed an annotated Ada. And Nabokov's late masterwork, and I have zero interest in reading that because the book itself doesn't move me, and kind of bores me, and no doubt every text of Nabokov's can give employment to a number of smart scholars, but that's not finally the most important thing about it. About the book.
I find, to be perfectly honest, I find him to be very, very difficult to read. I mean, I've picked up so many of his books and put them right down again because of this hyper-intellectual approach that he has, and for the other reasons that you've mentioned.
Yeah.
Whereas Lolita isn't like that. I mean, there's a completely different dimension. In Lolita. And by the way, I enjoyed the inclusion of the Groucho Marx quote that you put in there. I've put off reading Lolita for 6 years till she's 18. The book really impacted the culture rather widely. Do you think it was his greatest work?
Yeah, well, I guess so. I mean, let's see, is it my favorite Nabokov work? I think so. I've gotten a whole lot of pleasure out of Pale Fire, which not everybody likes, I know, and Speak Memory. I love that book. But I think it's. I mean, he considered it his greatest work, and that says a lot because, after all, he's a very self-defending writer, and. So he's essentially saying my most popular book, my easiest to read novel that even a smart 11 or 12-year-old can read, I think is my greatest work. So I go with him in that judgment.
Is it because his usual hyper-intellectualism gets a bit eclipsed by the emotion in the book and the emotion and the presence of that magical child, and the presence and the way he portrays her?
Yeah, that's part of it. Although I would go back to the book itself and its language. That it's just for me it's just fucking funny, line by line, and so perceptive, and also tremendously touching. I mean, he talks about when they were deep in their travels, they had reached a point where he would fake going to sleep, and then he would hear her wait a little bit, and then burst, start crying every night. Every night, and that's I don't know. It's hard. I'm hard pressed to come up with something in American literature that has moved me that much. And, as much as that little report. Very simple language.
Right. And he puts off, the usual arch cerebral tone of his prose is, in Lolita, put right off into Humbert. So he sort of uses Humbert to make fun of his own native, of Nabokov's own native archly intellectual quality by also making fun of it, as you say.
Right. I think that it's good to remember that although Nabokov had big struggles in his life, he lost all his money, they were kicked out of Russia, his father was murdered, a lot of trouble. Still, he saw himself, and despite his doubts about himself, he saw himself and was a tremendous winner. He could carry almost any room on his charisma and his verbal brilliance, and he was not shy. And he threw his weight around, and there were always some people who were very irritated and frightened by him, and then there were people who just adored him. They just loved him, and so he was, he was a guy who could find his way and get over in almost every situation. Well, he also, I think, pretty early in his life, probably in his 30s, he started seeing how there were aspects of his behavior, personal behavior, that were monstrous. That he had been very cruel to his brothers, for example, and that he had this impulse to say shitty things about other writers, and he knew that was he went too far, but he didn't stop it. He didn't want to stop it, and so his larger personal enterprise in his writing was to be more and more honest about what could be monstrous and very, very cruel about somebody who was brilliant.
Oh, it's an excellent point.
And so, and in Lolita is where it comes out maybe strongest. I mean, he's doing the same thing in Otta, but it's just tiresome at that point. So, I give him that's good.
Yeah, right.
He's not just congratulating himself on how brilliant he is. No, he's starting to see a very, other dimensions, darker.
Yeah, he's acknowledging his darker side. Yeah. Nabokov rather cunningly tells us that Lolita lost her virginity to a boy she meets at summer camp. And when Humbert finally has her alone to himself, it's Lolita who proposes that they engage in an act of eroticism that she considers to be merely a game, one that in her mind has no connection with childbirth. Was this an ingenious way of making the story slightly more palatable as well as complex by avoiding the deflowering of an adolescent by Humbert and making the girl herself initiate a physical seduction?
I think that's hard to answer, but I think it came out of his research about teenager sexuality. And he had discovered, he read all kinds of books about it before he really started writing. Average age of onset of menstruation, how often teenage girls masturbated, all of this stuff. It's in his notes. And I think he came upon the fact that something like 27% of girls of 15 had already had intercourse, something, like that. So he, in a way, thought he was being accurate when he did that. But I think, of course he's conscious of the fact that this throws a kind of an interesting complexity into the situation, and we do avoid that situation of a big, hairy brute, sticking his cock into a little squirming 12-year-old. It's
well said, Robert. Well said. You said before that I didn't know this. You said before that he and Edmund Wilson had many a chuckle over the story of O. Was it Maurice Girodias's English translation that they were looking at together? Nabokov's arch enemy, I should say, Maurice Girodias.
Yeah.
That's kind of ironic, then.
Yeah, it might not be. I forget if Girodias published the French edition too, because they both read French very well, both very easily.
Right. But that's kind of ironic, no? That he brought that story out and they're laughing about it. And yet he was really a great thorn in the side of Nabokov, even though he actually helped him quite a bit by publishing Lolita in France.
Right. Well, I think Nabokov probably had a really good time reading the story of O. I had a good time reading it when I read it. So, all kudos to the publisher, whoever he is.
Right. And Lolita even had the honor of being briefly banned in France as a result of pressure from British censors while it was being openly published in America. I thought that was also a very ironic and bizarre twist.
Yeah. Yes, it was. And it was just... but the way it all worked out for him was just... I mean, he could not have scripted it any better.
Oh, it's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, as you say somewhere in your book, without Edmund Wilson, there might not have been any future. What do you say? You say, without Wilson's stewardship, the road would have been different. There might not have been a road. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, he could have been like so many gifted writers.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm proud to say I published 3 stories in the New Yorker 14 years ago, and now I'm working hard at Cornell. I've got tenure, and I'm looking forward to my retirement when I can get back to my writing. I mean, really, that could have been it.
Mm-hmm.
That could have been his path. When I say that it was really fortunate how it worked out, I mean about Lolita, the fact that everybody said no in America. All of the, he got it to all the good and important publishers. Then, comes out in the Olympia Press edition, and that allows word of mouth to build to a frenzied point, especially after Graham Greene somehow gets his hands on a copy, and in 1955 writes, at the end of the year, he said, the 3 best books I read last year were A, B, and C, a book called Lolita that you've never heard of.
Mm-hmm.
And so then this drumbeat starts to build, and people start sneaking the book into the country in small numbers, but to influential people. And then, meanwhile, all the turmoil over Lady Chatterley's Lover and Tropic of Cancer is going on, and there are court cases, and finally it's getting to the point where, the defenders of decency are being recognized as completely ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And just as that logjam breaks, Putnam says, okay, we'll bring it out.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like, it was the first world success of a sex book after the break of that logjam.
Mm-hmm. And even the way it came into Putnam's hands is absolutely hysterical. You want to mention that?
Yeah, well, I thought that was great. Some questionable woman who, I don't know if she's questionable, but she was...
She was sort of what we would call today an exotic dancer, no?
Yeah, that's right. And obviously a good reader, too.
A good reader,
and,
yeah.
And she here's a sexy book, somebody gave it to her, and then she shows it to Minton, Putnam's editor-in-chief, and they're conducting an affair at the same time or a little later.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that the story that I really didn't think they were going to let me tell that story about Dmitri getting it on with Mrs. Minton, Polly Minton, because that's it's in the Berg archive, buried deep in a page-a-day diary, but and other people have read it, but nobody's ever been allowed to put it into a book or tried to. Maybe I'm the first one who thought it was a great story and wanted to. But when I submitted all of my quotations, you have to list everything you want to quote from a Berg, from a Nabokov source that's at the Berg Library, the Berg collection. You have to submit that to, and this really gave me the heebie-jeebies, to Andrew Wiley's agency. That's, the most powerful literary agency in America, and Wiley is known for protecting his brands. So I had to submit, I asked permission of the Wiley agency and also of the Berg collection. And so I have this long list of stuff, and, some of it is to quote, 3 words, it was a pretty day, but then there's this long quotation from Vera's account of that, where Dmitri and the distraught wife have a little fling.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow they all, signed off on it. I was very grateful that they did sign off on it.
And the other funny thing about this woman who told Putnam about it was she didn't even, I just read up, there's a chapter in Jean de Saint-Georges' book on the Olympia Press, Venus Bound. There's a chapter on the publishing of Lolita. Have you read that book? Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah.
And
so I can't quote it.
Yeah, so he says in there that this woman not only tipped Putnam off to the book and actually got a generous finder's fee for it, but it wasn't the Olympia Press edition that she'd read. She'd read it in a literary magazine. She'd read excerpts of Lolita in a literary magazine. Isn't that hysterical?
She read it. Yeah, she read it in the Anchor.
Right.
Anchor Review.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I always assumed it was the Olympia.
Yeah. So she was a very well-read person, well-read dancer.
Yeah.
Well, Robert, thanks so much for penciling me in and spending some time on this. This has just been a great talk. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, really, really fun, Rob. Needless to say, yours is the best prepared, most intelligent interview I've had. So, thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate hearing that. Thank you.